By June of 1920, with the appointment of a new divisional police commissioner in Munster, the Black and Tans hit back with a more extreme measure.
On the 3rd of June, Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Bryce Ferguson Smith was appointed Divisional Police Commissioner for Munster. And later that month, on the 19th of June I think it was, he addressed a bunch of RIC constables in Listowel, County Kerry.
When civilians approach, shout, "Hands up!" Should the order not be obeyed, shoot, and shoot with effect. If any persons approaching you carry their hands in their pockets or are in any way suspicious looking, shoot them down. You may make mistakes occasionally and innocent persons may be shot, but you're bound to get the right persons sometimes. The more you shoot, the better I will like you. And I assure you that no policeman will get in trouble for shooting any man, and I guarantee your names will not be given at the inquest.
Smith's order marked him out for attention from the Irish Volunteers, and 1 month later, on the 17th of July, he was in Cork City dining in the County Club when a 6-man squad of volunteers from Cork No. 1 Brigade burst into the club, held a gun to Smith's head and said, "Your orders were to shoot on sight. No, you're in our sights. Prepare to die." And they shot him dead. That gives an indication of the type of activity that was happening in Cork City throughout 1920.
The assassination of Colonel Smith in the city centre sent a shockwave through the British authorities. In response, a curfew order was issued by Major General Strickland, officer in command of Victoria Barracks, Cork.
This meant that after 10 o'clock at night that nobody could be seen on the streets. This was in cities, particularly in cities and towns. This not alone affected the volunteers, but it also affected the ordinary citizens and the population.
As the war continued to escalate, Winston Churchill conceived the idea of forming an elite mobile strike force. Recruitment was open to ex-commissioned officers of the British Armed Forces. This new force became known as the Auxiliary Division, or Auxies, as they became known locally. And within a very short time, they would strike terror into the ranks of the Irish Volunteers and the people of Ireland.
There was auxiliaries stationed in Macroom Castle, and they were notorious. One of their games, as it were, was driving through the countryside. They would take pot shots at people in the fields. They may not hit them directly, but would shoot at sods or something, get the earth to spatter up around them. And of course, the ordinary civilians would run, and this created a lot of harassment. But there were, I could quote numbers of people who lost their legs, who were injured for, damaged for life because of this game, as it were.
We had 4 elements to law and order in Ireland at that particular time, which was the RIC, who were contracting and doing a bad job very badly. You had the Black and Tans, who were doing a bad job even worse. You had the auxiliaries, who were supposed to do a better job than either of the other two, but as it turned out, didn't do that particularly well. And you had the British Army, who for the most part were adopting a reserve position. And that was correct. I mean, militarily that would be the right thing to do. You use the police elements first, and then when they can't function, then you introduce the army to do the job.
In an attempt to control Republican attacks in Cork City, the British authorities targeted the volunteer leadership. On August the 12th, 4 months before the city was burnt, the Lord Mayor, Terence McSweeney, was arrested in the City Hall and was charged with the possession of seditious documents. For the second time in 6 months, the cornerstone of democracy in the city was under assault. McSweeney was tried by court-martial and went on hunger strike. British policies in Ireland went centre stage in the international press as McSweeney was transferred to London's Brixton prison.
They had him in Brixton, and after a month it became news. He was still alive. So all the press from all over the world, the correspondents, came to London. And they watched day by day, and every morning they would send out a bulletin, the Lord Mayor's condition today. King George V begged Prime Minister Lloyd George to put an end to it, because even the stevedores in New York Harbour wouldn't empty British cargo ships. So he asked, the King asked the Prime Minister, could he not put an end to this? And the Prime Minister said, no.
The nation followed his hunger strike. It wasn't just something that was there and gone, it was on a daily basis. And Gandhi freely wrote later that it was the actions of Terence MacSweeney and his writings and his thinkings that influenced him in the way that he dealt with the British establishment.
As MacSweeney continued his hunger strike, the eyes of the world became focused on his cell in Brixton Prison. Back in Cork, his comrades were greatly concerned about the fate of their commanding officer. So a plan was conceived whereby the volunteers from the Cork Brigade would actually kidnap General Sir Peter Strickland, the officer commanding of the 6th Division, and hold them hostage in an attempt to get the British to release MacSweeney unconditionally.
The volunteers were becoming extremely confident in what they were doing, and probably one of the most notable examples of that at this particular time was the fact that they were actually prepared to try and kidnap General Strickland on St. Patrick's Hill, literally in the middle of the city, 300 yards from his front door.
This operation failed, and MacSweeney subsequently died on hunger strike on the 25th of October after 74 days.
When he died, the Bishop of St. George's in Southwark accepted him to lay in state in that cathedral, but he didn't want any display of military. But of course the volunteers couldn't resist the temptation. They brought his uniform over and they dressed him in it in the coffin. I think the bishop was a little bit annoyed about that. But then they had a public funeral through London.
His body is brought back. It's a massive Republican show of strength. It's a massive showing of emotion, of sympathy. And again, the volunteers are out there, and republicanism is out there. In terms of public display and in terms of people's feelings, I suppose it was extremely important, because this mattered. It wasn't just convenient for republicanism to use these funerals. And this was genuine sympathy and genuine feeling, and it really was an important landmark. Not just in terms of the propaganda war, if you want to see it like that, but in terms of how people felt.
Now, he never fired a shot in his life, my father. He was not a gunman. He was an intellectual. And his dying words to my Aunt Mary were, "Is the Republic established?" And I think the whole episode must have been very, very difficult. And my unfortunate mother, 3 years married, and he adored her and she adored him. I mean, it must have been, the effect on her must have been terrible.
The following day, young Kevin Barry is hanged in Mountjoy, stirring up again emotions and feelings. And it happens on a Sunday. People are en masse and people are gathering again, and there's a lot of, this collective feeling is building. Events on the ground are adding to that, of course. A couple of weeks later, Bloody Sunday happens in Dublin, with the Croke Park massacre following on the executions of the intelligence officers. And then at a local level in Cork, the Kilmichael ambush happens a week later again, towards the end of November.
On the 28th of November, at Kilmichael in West Cork, an IRA flying column led by Tom Barry set up an ambush for the invincible auxiliaries, 12 days before Cork City was burnt.
Tom Barry was brought in as a training officer. He had been in the British Army, and he was out in Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq, and he thought, here am I fighting for the British Army, the same army that's fighting my people in Dublin. So when he came home after a while, he got involved in intelligence with the 3rd Cork Brigade, and then they appointed him as a training officer of the flying column. Kilmichael ambush came at a period when morale was low, and also it came at a time when the auxiliaries and the black and tans were really harassing the people throughout the country.
On the 20th day of November, the tans left the town of Macroom. They were seated.
These auxiliaries would go on the route to Dunmanway and often in places like Balneen and so on, and shoot up people, strip men in front of women and everything. They just were notorious, and Tom Barry said they should be tackled. He decided that he would pick Kilmichael because the auxiliaries would go, particularly on a Sunday, on their rampage through the country, and they felt that they would surely pass, and they would have maybe 1, 2 or maybe 3 lorry loads of them.
It rained all night as we marched, and we got here without anybody knowing it. We came across fields and through boreens, and the men were soaking wet. From 8 o'clock in the morning, they were in their positions, and they weren't allowed to lift their head in case they'd be observed. They had no food. It freezed hard, and their wet clothes were quite stiff. And they waited and waited and waited.
At 4:05, the auxiliaries came into view, and the ambush started. Barry stood out in a uniform, a volunteer's uniform, and he had a Mills bomb in one hand, an automatic in the other. And he threw the Mills bomb, and it was an open-top lorry, and so the ambush began.
It was a bloody fight. It was a bitter fight. But eventually, anyway, 9 of the auxiliaries lay killed on the road. The second lorry had come to rest 35 yards from number 2 section, and they were fighting back and engaging the section. I heard these fellas shouting, "We surrender, we surrender." And we saw them, some of them throw their rifles away. And when they did, 3 of this section stood up, and 2 of them, the auxiliaries opened fire immediately on them, and they killed them with revolver fire. And I shouted at the same time to the section, "Keep firing and don't stop till I tell you." And they tried to surrender again, and I said, "Don't take any surrender." These fellows were all eventually killed.
This was a military operation, as the IRA saw it, as Tom Barry saw it, as the famous flying column saw it, and Republicans really, it was a great morale boost for Republicans in terms of how the war was going, you know, and it really was a significant event. And it links directly into Cork because, of course, the bodies of those auxiliaries were brought back into the city.
In the days following the ambush, Cork braced itself for the inevitable act of revenge by the Crown forces. The military authorities imposed martial law in an attempt to maintain law and order in the city.
The critical thing to understand here in the context of what happened in Cork at that particular time was that when martial law is imposed, it means that all civil law has failed. The civil structure for administering justice has failed, and that is precisely what the case was at this particular time. The RIC had been driven back more and more into the centres of population and were not functioning. You had a situation where the volunteer movement, if you want to call it, was having an effect on their ability to rule, if you wish. And when the military are introduced, it means that literally they are authorised to restore order, whatever way they wish to do it.
With tension mounting in the city, martial law came into effect on the 10th of December. Cork City was now firmly in control of the military. But within 24 hours, Cork was to experience a night of violence, destruction and terror, the extent of which could never have been anticipated.